would be pleased, dear Marit, Firman, and dear Thomas, if you would all show your faces for just a second so we know who you are, the curators team. Let's see if we can see you. Let's try again, Firman. Just briefly show your faces. I can see Firman here. So it doesn't seem to work, so we do it again by the end of this event. But thanks anyway. Our dialogue today, and for the time being the last one, is about conservation and exploitation of resources in a neo-colonial context. This is not a new topic. Already more than 2 decades ago, actors like scientists, women's rights activists, and later Nobel laureate Wangari Maathai from Kenya spoke about a persisting form of colonialism in this context, and like to quote her: "There are covetousnesses over our resources, and we are vulnerable to anyone who wants to exploit us. It feels like the 18th century. In the past, people used force to gain access to African mineral sources. Today, the means are no less lethal, but they are disguised to get African leaders and people to cooperate." In addition to her critique of the global north, she also repeatedly appealed to the agency of southern actors, and I quote again: "When the soils are eroding and the water is polluted, when the air is poisoned and all the mineral resources are sold, there will be nothing left for us to call our own. Our real work is in the restitution, the reclaiming and taking back what is essential so that we can move forward. Plant trees, speak our languages, tell our stories." Our panelists today will tell some of those stories. Together, we will explore questions about exploitation, land grabbing, and oppression on the one hand, and at the same time preserving nature in its wild state in the spirit of conservation. We would like to invite all of you to join the dialogue following the panel discussion. Feel free to get active on Twitter under the hashtag #decolonialdialogues. And last but not least, we would like to take the opportunity to thank Aisha Kamara, who has been guiding us through this dialogue series and joining the discussion for the past 2 years. Thank you so much for your great moderation. Aisha will also introduce today's panelists afterwards and guide us through the event once again. But first, we will hear Firman Girmay with a few introductory words about today's event. And with it, I would like to hand over and would like to wish you another inspiring session. Firman, over to you. Thank you so much, Maria. I am delighted to be able to welcome you on behalf of the curatorial team that I'm privileged to form together with Marit Ifeoma-Kupka and Thomas Föß. Today's event marks the end of the second part of our series, Decolonial Dialogues, which began in 2022. Marie already said so. We would like to invite you to understand colonialism even more broadly, perceive more facets, and add more levels of actors. Specifically, together with our panelists, we look at connections between colonialism and climate change, and between colonialism and nature conservation. Both fields represent a larger, underexposed, but also integral part of our shared colonial past, and both continue to have an impact even today. The increase in harmful emissions, which drove climate change to extremes, is closely linked to the industrialization of the global north, which in turn has always been massively dependent on the exploitation of African resources, not only in times of formal colonialism, but still today. Until today, it is the countries of the global north that are the main polluters of harmful emissions worldwide. But the climate crisis doesn't really ask about the polluters. It affects all people and living beings the same worldwide. Yet average such as the global temperature rise or the 1.5-degree limit mask the inequality with which the climate crisis is hitting. Many regions of the African continent are being hit really hard, much harder than this would be hitting a considerable part of the global north. And this is quite irrespective of the question of how high the emissions are locally. And we all know that they're tens of times lower. Drought, heat, landslides, floods are the order of the day in many African countries. Ecosystems are collapsing. The climate crisis also has brutal economic consequences. The productivity is falling, while the costs of climate protection and adaptation are rising enormously. The already existing social inequality is exacerbated both in the local and in the global context. Compensation payments, which were promised with great fanfare, failed to materialize. Those who proclaim a global collective fight against climate change must first acknowledge who bears the main blame for it, historically as well as at present. And we must acknowledge that there's an imbalance in the question of who bears the greatest consequence. Political consequences have to be drawn. Responsibility must grow out of guilt. When voices from the global north call on African countries to cut emission, this really against the backdrop of their shared history and against the backdrop of the unequal distribution of emissions today and the unequal blame for climate change seems downright absurd. The absurdity increases immeasurably when heads of government like our Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, travel, like in his case, to Senegal in view of the current energy crisis and ask for the extraction of natural gas to cover our needs. This shows that even today, we don't really have a common picture of the size of the ecological crisis, its causes, and its consequences. And this is precisely what we will be asking today. We will also hear that colonizers practiced nature conservation in parallel to the exploitation of natural resources. So while forcibly subduing earth, animals, and humans to their own economic interests, they cultivated the protection of flora and fauna as an integral part of the so-called European civilization mission. There are few examples and phenomena that demonstrate the bigotry of the colonial project as vividly as this nature conservation. Our panelists will also talk about how landscapes and societies have been marked by it and how dominant remains in shaping the image of Africa in this country today. The exoticization of Black people, the invention of wilderness as a romantic counter-design to modernity, local ideas about African people and landscapes are corroded by cliches that have their origins in colonialism and the nature conservation established there. At the same time, nature conservation has brutal consequences for many people, displacement, deprivation of their own livelihood, for example. There's no question that we want to preserve our biodiversity, that we have to fight climate change and prepare for its consequences. But in order to fight against this together, it is essential that we develop a common understanding of the role that nature and conservation has played in European-African relations and is still playing. We, the curators, are very much looking forward to today's dialogue with our panelists, and we are very much looking forward to Aisha Kammer leading us through the discussion once again. Thank you so much.
Vielen Dank, lieber Filmon, für diese.
Thank you so much, Filmon, for this very nice introduction. Thank you once again to Maria Kind and the Heinrich-Böll Foundation to have me once again with you, be able to lead you through the day. Cliches. This is a buzzword. Well, nature conservation usually has quite a positive image, and many people in Europe would not really combine or connect it to racism or violence. Usually those who are interested here are considering the threat to animals or nice landscapes. And I'm a child of the 90s, and I think the whole generation had a WWF poster in their rooms with one of those species in danger of extinction. And this is what we talk about today, green colonialism. And Dr. Morgai Ogada has written a book that says the big nature conservation lie. And he says that nature conservation is presented as peaceful, leftist and liberal, but it is elitist, it is violent and often racist in reality. So whenever we talk about the relations between Africa and Europe, we do have those different perspectives. And with that, we would like to enter our last round of encounters in the decolonial dialogues with our very interesting experts that I will present in just a few minutes. And then afterwards, you will have the possibility to ask your questions after the presentation via the Q&A tool that you will find down below. On your screens, you can write your questions, you can raise your hand if time allows. I cannot really promise that, but if you might be allowed to speak out. And with that, we would like to start with our debate, and I'm really happy to present my panelists. So maybe they can switch on their cameras right now so we know whom we will be talking to. Who we will be talking to. Thank you so much. That's great. So let's start with the first round of introductions, and then we come to our questions. We have with us Professor Dr. Abi Sène. She is a member of the Faculty of Natural Park Management at the Clemson University and an interdisciplinary social researcher. And the goal of her work is to make progress on socially, environmentally equitable approaches to public lands and natural cultural resource management in the US mainly and on the African continent. She works at the interface between protected areas, governance, community development, sustainable livelihoods, race, and nature. So many different fields that are combined and come here together. And we are really happy to have her with us, Dr. Abi Sène. Thanks for coming. And then next in line, we have with us Dr. Bernhard Gisebel. He is an historian, studied German language as well in Munich and Swansea in the UK. And at the University of Mannheim, he did his PhD. And his focus in research is the history of the animal and human relations, colonialism in Africa, and religion and environment. And many of you might know his book, The Nature of German Imperialism, published in 2016, Nature and Qualities of Wildlife in Eastern Africa. So we're really happy to have you with us here on board to discuss with us Nath Gisebel. And then the third one in line, we have with us Dr. Shruti Nath. She has studied mathematics and earth sciences and later specialized in atmospheric and climate sciences at the ETH in Zurich, and her focus is on the understanding of chaotic interactions within weather and climate systems. And she tries to bring order into this chaos with her scientific instruments. And her field of application currently are land-climate interactions. She uses mathematics in order to understand the effects of land use change on climate. And I think those are really new and burning challenges. So really happy to have her with us. Thank you so much for coming. And with it, we would like to kick off our debate with a historical view. Of course, we're talking about colonialism, so it's important to get our basics straight. So nature and wilderness are the two buzzwords, so to say, and our starting point. So I would like to ask Ms. Sène. So one of those cliches when we talk about the African continent is the image of untouched nature, of wilderness. To what extent does this image, which is quite an artificial one, to what extent does it have its origin in colonialism and colonial relations?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here today. And I just wanted to welcome members of the audience as well. So thank you for starting this off with that very important question that lays the foundation for understanding nature conservation today in Africa, right? And so when we talk about pristine and untouched environment, right, it's the idea, it's what we refer to as wilderness, right? I think most of us have heard of what wilderness is just these images of landscapes that are completely emptied of people, right? Animals roaming with no humans within those spaces. Or if you have humans, is what we traditionally refer to, at least for more critical analysts like myself, we refer to it as the presentation of the noble savage, right? The noble indigenous African savage who is in relationship with wildlife and nature as well. But that in itself, that construction of the image, right, was foundational and part and partial to the imperialist expansion of Europeans into Africa, right? The idea that these places were not only barren land and emptied land, it gives them the social license, in a sense, to go there and and take over, because these were emptied land, when that was not the case, right? Indigenous African native communities were living in those spaces, and they were very much touched by their own traditional livelihood practices that have equally shaped the ecological processes of that region. So it is not so much that they were untouched, right? They're very much changed by cultural practices, but also they weren't empty. So the justification that because these were empty and that's why we came in is very much completely dubious. And I have to say also that it was the same process that happened with when the British arrived, also the European explorers arrived in the US. I mean, the idea of wilderness really originated in the United States with the establishment of Yellowstone National Park. I think it was in 1872, 150 years ago, where there were all the indigenous communities in the United States were completely dispossessed of their land under the pretext of creating national parks, right? Creating this very European image of what landscape should look like. And so it came at grave consequences, right? This model was exported throughout much of the colonial much of the colonial world in Africa, Latin America, and in Asia as well, and in settler colonial United States and New Zealand, Australia. And so, yes, the fabrication of this untouched land of wilderness was part and parcel of the imperialist expansion and of colonial powers. And I'm sure Bernard he's written a wonderful book on precisely that, the construction of the German nature in Tanzania that have roots in the colonial era.
Well, you said it all, Amy, but if I might just perhaps add a few things since you mentioned Yellowstone. And I switched to German, which is easier for me, weil eben Yellowstone erwähnt wurde.
So the Yellowstone National Park was mentioned in 1872. We know that Yellowstone and Yosemite were the early and famous national parks, but also Serengeti in East Africa, which is like the ideal of empty landscape with large animal herds. However, this environment was not empty. There were indigenous communities who lived there and had their livelihoods there. What is usually coming up in the nature conversation stories that we tell ourselves in Germany is that this idea did not come up as in order to protect but it emerged in, I mean, there were two parallel things, so the colonialism and also the protection, and what was also there were the colonies as a consequence. And as we've already heard, the view of the colonizers was that there are these noble wild people, savages, and with a view to Africa, we have a clear connection to the colonization, hunting of elephants and other wild species, and people reacted to the hunting with nature conservation areas and the introduction of nature conservation. And in Europe, this sacral character of untouched nature plays a very important role, and the idea of an empty nature, uninhabited nature, which only waited for Europeans to explore it. Sorry, there's some technical glitch here. And the presence of large animals was considered as original, and this wilderness idea is one of the key ideologies of the colonialization, because it legitimizes the colonization. Maybe one last aspect, which is very important for the emergence of this colonial wilderness, which is the inability of the European colonizers to read correctly these landscapes. Sorry, the sound connection is interrupted time and again. So these landscapes were considered in a war-like connection, and the Europeans were not able to recognize cultivated lands. So this wilderness is this supposed wilderness was basically the product of human interaction. Thank you very much. To come back to what you just said with this reading of landscapes and the century-old so-called nature conversation, have they inscribed themselves in these landscapes? I mean, you said they were not really able to understand the nature on the ground. Did this change nature? Did it inscribe itself in nature? Well, one effect was, and this gradually developed in Eastern Africa, that at the beginning, the first reservations were not empty of people. I mean, they were erected in areas where there were supposedly no indigenous people. However, the colonizers knew the country too little in order to recognize how many indigenous people lived there. So we earlier heard about the noble savage, but this derives from the understanding that some civilizations who supposedly live in harmony with nature are compatible with the existence of these conservation areas and could continue to live there. For example, in the Congo, in the first national park, and also in East Africa, the Maasai, up until the 1950s, they could have their cattle herds in the Serengeti. But in the 1950s, with the upcoming decolonization, the ideology came through that nature works best if it's left alone. And here are scientific ideas, how we scientifically grasp nature, like ecology, which is a non-human system. This is the way how we analyze it up until today from a scientific point of view. So this was basically the blueprint for the conviction that the management of these conservation systems is done best when there are no humans involved, if the ecosystem is there without humans and can develop without any human interaction. Thank you very much. Do you want to add something?
Yes, sure. I also wanted,
Ja, natürlich.
On top of everything that Bernard has just mentioned so brilliantly, I also wanted to add that one thing that's often not talked about is how conservation in the colonial era, right, has also catapulted African or indigenous Africans into capitalist relation between themselves and also and colonists, right? Like I can and that theory is also there. And I apologize, I can't remember the author of the article, but he has clearly laid out how completely so subsistence hunting, for example, pastoralism, right, taking away the land of indigenous Africans that are, and they're no longer able to self-sustain themselves, right, have become reliant on the cash economy, right? And so that is also already forcing them into a capitalist mode of living, right? But also using them as labor. If you take away their land, if you take away their rights to hunt, right? Indigenous hunting was banned, but yet say trophy hunting, which is an entire other discussion, right? Because trophy hunting has also, in a sense, financed the British imperialist expansion in Africa, right? So you ban indigenous hunting in the name of conservation, and so you are forcing them to labor for colonists, right? And so that in itself is already starting to establish these modes of production under capitalism, right? And so that is something that is often not discussed necessarily, that conservation, yes, was part and parcel into the imperialist expansion, the dispossession of local communities to construct nature in the image of the European. But the other side of it too was that it was also fundamental in thrusting indigenous Africans into capitalist modes of production. So it also started to plant the seed of capitalism, or at least labor relations between indigenous Africans who can no longer have their land because it has been taken away, who can no longer hunt, right, for subsistence, and thrusting them to work for their colonialists. So it also had that function as well. And if you look at the lands that are primarily targeted today, yes, they're land that are highly biodiverse, but they're land of agrarian and pastoralist Africans who still continue to escape the logic of capitalism, right? And so pastoralists like the Maasai, but not just the Maasai, even in West Africa, right? The Fulani pastoralists are often targeted. They're forced to sedentarize in the name of conservation. So there is a deliberate target of pastoralism because of what it represents, which is, in a sense, a non-capitalist form of dairy production, but also meat production as well, that does not work well for capitalist expansion.
Vielen Dank. Eine letzte Frage.
Many things. And one last question I would have for Sène before we include Nath in the discussion. Of course, we could talk a lot about those different issues, but maybe just a few words about where nature finds itself and nature conservation today. So what is the state of the art today? So how did these colonial patterns change, or did they remain to be present right now?
So in nature conservation, not much has changed, right? Like the colonial relations in nature conservation has very much continued to reinstate itself, even though it transforms itself into the illusion that African communities have more control over conservation programs. That is simply untrue, right? Like if you look at how much the funding that goes on, but also who really directs some of these projects, they're predominantly Europeans, or at least from NGOs that are European funded NGOs, but also US funded NGOs like the WWF, the Nature Conservancy, and so on and so forth. who continue to run and dictate conservation programs in Africa. But Native Africans have said time and again that the only way to really maintain and to undo these colonial relationships is, for one, to have not just have protected areas, but have protected areas that don't dispossess them, right? The dispossession of Africans itself for the expansion of protected areas is very much embodies that ongoing colonial relations that we're seeing, because a lot of these protected areas at the end of the day end up being privatized, right? And that privatization continue to only benefit European organizations or corporations as well. And so it's still there, even though they talk about community-based conservation, even though they talk about Africans being able to still benefit economically from conservation programs, the distribution of benefits is grossly inequitable. Africans are still not able to be to profit. I mean, not profit, but to benefit from conservation projects, even if they're selling it as a community-based conservation program.
Vielen, vielen Dank. Wir machen
Many things, and I think we will shed some light on possibilities and solutions, but right now I think it would be a good idea to broaden the view and to talk about another crisis that we have at our hands. This is a crisis where, well, here in Europe, we basically always talk about it, the climate crisis, and Shruti is using statistical means in order to look into climate models. How can we accelerate the processes? And therefore, we would like to know from you. We have heard about Europe contributing to nature conservation. How did Europe contribute to the climate crisis, and what role did industrialization play for the resources of the African continent? I think we just lost Shruti. I hope she will be back in just a second. Hope to have her back with us soon. So if we cannot recuperate her, so I might get back to Bernard Gesibbe. If we think and hear about the current debates about the energy crisis, and if we look at how strategies are drawn up and what the federal government of Germany is doing, activism, how would you assess the different proposals that are on the table and the different initiatives that come from Europe in order to tackle the climate crisis together with the African continent? Yeah, they basically take over the very problematic colonialism in Africa and in the global south as a whole. So there's basically a seamless continuation of what we've seen earlier. So what we've seen in the last years is that we have a cohesion of the climate discourse and the biodiversity discourse. So they are growing closer together. And when we talk about the extension of nature conservation areas in the framework of the 30 by 30 objective, is that we have the problem that this is retrieved from the climate debate, and that we are not only bringing forward arguments of biodiversity, but as well arguments in order to tackle the climate crisis, that those forest regions have to be protected. They are referred to as carbon sinks in order to bind CO2. And this, of course, increases the problem of marginalization, the communities in the affected areas and the numbers of people affected. In the framework of the 30 by 30 objective is quite alarming. The Rainforest Alliance UK has come to the conclusion is that if this area would be protected, then we're talking about 300 million people being in danger of being displaced. And this, of course, increases the problems that have already existed. Abi directly, and then we take Shruti on board before she leaves us again.
Yes, and I also wanted to add that even though protected area, the expansion of protected area doesn't necessarily mean, yes, there's a dispossession, but does it also mean that areas that deforestation will slow down, logging will slow down, extraction will slow down? Not necessarily, because we are also seeing that a lot of these protected areas, our governments are leasing or giving private, concession rights to extractive industries to be able to continue to mine, but also clear forests for plantation inside areas that were designated as protected area, for conservation. So the 30 by 30 plan, one of the dangers of it too is that, is it really going to protect landscape as we wanted 10, 20 years down the line if extractive industries have the power to buy permits in order to continue to mine in those areas?
Ja, vielen, vielen Dank. Und jetzt würde ich
Many thanks for this outlook, and with that we come back in order for us to have a common stance on the climate crisis and talk about the basics of nature conservation. So it would be great to hear some facts about that, of how Europe contributed to the climate crisis with the industrialization and what role it plays for the resources of the African continent. I think it would be really interesting to hear more about those facts from Shruti and Nath.
So I'll be talking in English. Thank you for the introduction, Aisha, and I will briefly touch on exactly what the climate crisis entails in terms of responsibility. So we are currently facing a climate crisis that is, without a doubt, the Earth's temperatures are 1.2 degrees Celsius higher. This year, we've seen record-shattering temperatures, and also we are almost experiencing the hottest year that we're going to experience in a while since 2016. So it's definitely quite striking what's going on. And I have some quick facts to also put this more into perspective in terms of colonialism and also historical emissions. So I'll quickly share my screen if that's okay. And I hope everyone can see it. So yeah, I'll just briefly touch on these figures from the Lancet report. What we're seeing here is the responsibility for excess emissions ahead of a safe budget. What I mean by a safe budget is the excess emissions ahead of safe planetary boundary conditions, so within which we would actually have a safe environment where everyone could properly live and subsist. And this is accounting for the excess emissions when we look at historical emissions also. And when you look at the responsibility of climate breakdown, so how much of our excess emissions that are contributing towards pushing our planetary boundary conditions are divided amongst all countries, you can see how it looks like when we also consider the historical emissions. A striking feature here is that 70%, so both USA and the EU account for close to 70% of our excess emissions. That's a lot. That's, more than 3/4. That's 3/4 of the world basically being led down this road. And apart from that, 8% of the emissions that we see right now contributing toward excess is from the global south. So countries in Africa and countries also within South Asia and South America contribute very little towards the climate crisis that we're seeing. What's more is that we actually do not fully account for the colonial emissions of the USA, or not the USA, but the EU. So the emissions that they've also contributed towards due to what they've done to the land in the former colonies, and what that accounts for. And this is just, you could see the reference over here. It's from the Lancet report that was released in 2020. Yeah, but the message here is that over 70% of emissions do not come from the global south. What's more is that the global south, however, is experiencing the worst conditions from climate change. So Africa itself has seen a 0.3 degrees Celsius rise in temperature since the 1990s, and this is higher than the global average. People in Africa are highly vulnerable. So you can see this big map that's extracted from the IPCC Assessment Report 6 on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And you can see that the more red it is, the more highly vulnerable the populations are. The shaded areas also show areas where we have denser populations, so where there are more people. And it goes without a doubt that there are lots of people in Africa, it's quite densely populated, but also they're going to be highly vulnerable to all the effects from climate change. So to summarize this, Africa is experiencing a more rapid rate of increase in temperatures, and the people there are highly vulnerable to it also. You can see on the right panel how this affects challenges to development, so including access to water, access to literature, access to healthcare. And again, what's really striking is that from all continents, Africa has all of these, of its pillars of being able to develop sustainably affected by climate change. They're highly vulnerable. To put this into perspective and also to now go into a more sort of personal area, I come from Kenya, and in general, the food productivity in Africa has been affected by climate change. There's a 34% decrease from the World Meteorological Organization report in 2022. But in East Africa, we've seen the worst drought in 40 years, and this is known to be made 100 times more likely in terms of severity due to climate change from a World Weather Attribution report. What we see due to this is that 23 million people are highly under stress from food insecurity, and this mainly affects smaller children and causes a lot of malnutrition, which then has longer lasting effects as we go through generations. It affects women, it affects a lot of people in informal settlements, and what's more is it's displaced a lot of people across the Sahel region. To now bring this again to a bit more of a connection to the EU and what can be done and what should be done and what has been done, there's been adaptation finance promised since 2009, according to the Copenhagen Accord. And this was later ratified in Cancun during the COP16. However, a lot of the finance that's been provided, so it was $100 billion that was promised per year. Out of them, only 25% are actual grants. The rest of the finance comes with strings attached, so it's all loans. It's all sometimes also, I think we've seen the Africa Climate Summit happen now, and they've pledged a lot of money, but also a lot of money has been given in terms of forgiving debt and in hope that it's redirected to renewables. But there's still always a lot of strings attached in terms of how to help Africa cope with climate change that it hasn't necessarily contributed to, but unfortunately is highly vulnerable to. So yeah, I'd like to leave us on that note and see what discussions we come up with from that.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much for the very impressive maps and description of what we talk about when you talk about climate change, because climate change, of course, affects everyone, as we say in Germany, but this is a different the thing that you described here, obviously 40% of the emissions are coming from the US, 30 from Europe. And of course, we know the debates here, but how is the debate in the US, the debate about the climate crisis, energy crisis, how are the US trying to mitigate that? Maybe you can describe it, even though it's not your special expertise. And I mean, we've just heard the figures and facts by Shruti Nath. Maybe you can say something about that.
Is that for me or for Shruti? Oh, for myself. Okay. Yes. Where do I start? Because I think for a country that is probably the largest contributor of carbon emission, right? There's a very not enough debate. If anything, there's actually a deliberate attempt to completely sideline the conversation around climate, especially when we talk about climate reparations in Africa. I mean, we have seen John Kerry, who was the special envoy at the UN, the African Climate Summit, who was sent there, and said, outrightly refused to have any conversations around climate reparations, right? But instead, he talked about offset, right, as a form of green financing, right? Opening up carbon offset market, which in itself is also an entire other controversial area. So in the US, from governments, from politicians to the public, there is a denial of the responsibility that the US bears on the climate breakdown. And the intentional silencing of the indigenous communities that have been fighting, to claim their lands, to be able to protect it against climate breakdown, but also more radical environmentalism that has been completely shut down as well by the governments. And so what we are given are just what I call band-aids, just to quell the form of resistance, right? From where I'm standing and what I see on TV, it seems like the conversation around climate justice is much more progressive in a sense in Europe than what I'm seeing here in the United States, because this is really, I think, the rejection, for example, of any alternative forms of like socialism, for example, conversations around socialism in a way that can finally break us free from these structures that have created the climate crisis, right, is also being completely, it's taboo to even talk about it. So the general sense, from my sense, not just mine, but even for those of us who are in the progressive side of the debate, it's very difficult, right, to move the needle because of the propaganda of the fossil fuel, in a sense, right, that is completely greenwashing their image and selling the public that technological transition or technological solution is going to get us out of this crisis that we're in. So in the US, there is not much, I don't see it coming. If we're talking about solutions, I am not very optimistic that it will come from the US, especially if John Kerry, the special envoy for the government, went to Africa and outrightly say that they refuse to play any kind of climate reparations or even have a honest debate around US bearing so much responsibility in terms of the climate crisis. Not very optimistic, but I think I'm being more realistic that much of the solution might not come from the US government, I should say, the US governments and corporations. There are still pockets of citizens who are well informed and really doing a lot of great work, trying to move us into a more feasible and more just and equitable and get us out of this climate crisis. A lot of them are Native Americans, I mean, indigenous movements. Others are also African Americans, right? Those are the ones who are really bearing the brunt of the climate crisis in the United States. And so they are mobilizing to change the needle. Unfortunately, I think the US government is equally pushing back on some of these narratives that is really stopping a mass mobilization to demand change from the US government.
Vielen Dank. Sehr, sehr
And thank you very
interessant.
much. That's very interesting. I think for many in the audience to hear about the debate in the US. And then, of course, as you said, in Europe, we might be a little bit more advanced in the debate. I mean, we are only talking about politics and not about civil society organizations or NGOs. And so I would like to direct the next question to Shruti, who lives in Switzerland and in Germany, so who knows about this region. So how's your personal take on the climate policy in these countries?
Kann sein, dass die Internetverbindung.
Maybe the internet connection has failed, Shruti. Did you hear the question? Hello? Is this just my internet or?
Okay. Dann gebe ich die Frage vielleicht an
So, okay. Then I will direct the question to Bernhard Gisebel, although I would have liked to ask her that question. Oh, suddenly I am a climate expert. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the interesting and remarkable figures, and also showing the historic justice debate and defense debate. I mean, in my view, this hardly plays a role in the public debate, and in the political debate, it doesn't play a role at all. So my impression is that if the view becomes a global one, if the perspective becomes global, then the progressive part of the climate debate uses the international incidents to convince the most skeptical parts of society of the fact that climate change is underway, and that the societies here and the industrialized countries have to act. If I might extemporize, in science, in the scientific community, there is a larger debate about the historical responsibilities. There's this whole debate about the Anthropocene. So the question is whether we already live in a new era on our planet, which is characterized by human actions. And here, this historic dimension is quite important, because we have a hot debate here. When there is this Anthropocene, when we have started to live in this Anthropocene, when did it start? With this quick acceleration in the past, or at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century with industrialization? But when it comes to the current debate in general, I think it doesn't play a role. And concerning the political answers and responses, I mean, we also talked about critical development policy, and what Germany is doing at the moment is not really sufficient. We've stopped having discussions about deadly help, for example. However, the figures that we've heard from Shruti and the reality of climate change in Africa is one that would require more funding in the course of development aid. And Shruti has mentioned that sometimes linked to certain requirements. However, this reaches a dimension where we can hardly monitor how the funding is used. I think we've lost her again. So whenever she is able to join us again, we will have her in between. But so far, unfortunately, I think she has left us again, so maybe the technicals can call her via telephone or let her join in a different way. But with regard to the time, I would like to talk about raw materials and the export of raw materials. Shruti.
Hi, yeah, sorry, I got back. Yeah, about the European policies, I think personally, I see it.
Ich glaube, it would be the best, Shruti, if you just keep your camera off, and then we probably cannot see you anymore. Okay, Shruti, einfach reinrufen, wenn es wieder
Good,
möglich ist.
Shruti, just shout out if you have joined us again, if you're back again. So we're trying to solve the problem in the background. I mean, this is live. We are on different continents and different places and different time zones. So this is part of the business, basically. So thanks to the technical support team in the background. And then, she's back again. Okay.
Oh no. I'll quickly try to say it. Yeah, so I think there's the adaptation finance that's been promised, and there's also loss and damage. So these unavoidable costs that we're seeing of climate change. I think the EU is doing a better job than the US, but that's setting a really low benchmark. I think there's so much more that could be done. Again, I'd like to emphasize that less than a quarter of finance that was already given was without strings attached. But the fact of the matter is these countries cannot take any more debt on. In fact, they're sinking in it. And I think one massive thing also is to consider how much debt these countries have. I know that actually Germany is considering forgiving around 60, I think it was 60 million debt that Kenya holds, as long as they redirect it towards renewables and stuff. And that's fine, but I think it needs to also be reconsidered that these countries have debt, but they also need much more to cope with the unavoidable costs of a crisis that is not brought about by them, and also to cope with how to adapt. Another thing is that a lot of the finance that's provided has been for mitigation purposes instead. So it's not actually going on the ground to help people to adapt to really devastating consequences. It's only around 39% that's actually going to that, and the rest is just going for mitigation. So I think, yeah, personally, I think there's a lot to do in terms of debt relief and also providing actual non-strings attached adaptations so these countries can cope.
Can I just add really quickly that the amount that was promised by the US, I think it was so minuscule. It was almost ridiculous. $30 million in the US budget. It was what was promised by John Kerry at the African Summit, Climate Summit for climate adaptation. And just imagine the amount of money, you know, of the US military complex in the amount of the trillion, but yet $30 million is what the US has allocated towards adaptation. I think that was outrightly, it sent a very clear message it was much more symbolic than actual help, that the US will not stand in trying to get African countries to transition out of this mess that the US and EU and others have created. So just wanted to add that since we're talking about financing.
And since we're discussing number, I might just add numbers from Germany, not in the context of climate mitigation, but die Gelder, die die Bundesrepublik
the funding that is invested in nature conservation in Africa from Germany. This is one of those items where the federal government is extremely proud, because it's one of the biggest donors on the African continent. And I think last year we were talking about 800 million a year And you were talking about 30 million from the States. So I think this number has, or at least it has been announcement to increase this number to 1.5 billion euros a year. So funding has been rededicated in order to provide this support. But of course, the very important question is if what is done with those with this money. And the big nature conservation organizations, Senckenberg, ZGF, and in views of the Montreal Agreement, they have really positioned themselves for a big push towards mitigating the biodiversity crisis in order to mobilize this funding, in order to extend protection areas and that climate change consequences are supposed to fall in order to reinstigate those biodiversity sites. So who are we talking about? Who are the other partners, the other allies in the partnerships? Are those European or NGOs from the global north? Or is this money really earmarked for the use from the local communities? So this is what we should actually talk about when we talk about equitable governance. But the question is it really used that way? So when we look back in the past, we are not really hopeful that this is something that finally happens. So what is needed is empowerment from the bottom, local NGOs and local projects. This is what should be funded. Many thanks. I don't know if Sène would like to comment on what's been said.
Yes, I just really quickly in terms of how much funding also the German government has given for biodiversity conservation, it's significant. It's a lot of money, and while it seems very commendable, I think what we also ought to be careful is how that funding is also being distributed, as Bernard just pointed out, but also where, not in terms of just are the local communities getting money from it? That's very important, but also oftentimes it's funding a lot of violent conservation programs, right? Like I know that the US is also donating, and I don't know the exact figure of how much the US government is funding for biodiversity conservation, but a lot of it is actually opening up market for the military industrial complex, right? They are buying basically much of that money goes into artillery for anti-poaching, the war against poaching. It's also increasing surveillance technologies. And so I think Dr. Rosalind Duffy has written a brilliant book called Global Security and Conservation, who's written really well on militarized conservation and how much of that money, that funding, that seemed quite a lot, is also going towards militarized forms of conservation in Africa.
Nein, mit Sicherheit nicht. Und,
yes, definitely this is not something that we would need. Before we, of course, this is a hugely complex issue, and we would need a lot more time in order to name all the problems, to find solutions, and to look towards the potential that would be at the hands of the local communities if they were to be supported, right? But I would like to briefly comment on the issue of resources, the export of resources from the African continent to the global north, energy, everything, raw materials that we need in order to produce our smartphones and so on. So how does this come into play? Export of resources from the African continent. Who would like to cover that? Sène, feel free.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment on that. And I think that the export of raw materials is really still continues to be the defining terms of, of post-colonial relations, right? Like all the global economic structures that that shape relationship between African countries, the EU and the US and Canada, or I should even say African countries and the global north or global south or global north, much of these global economic countries are set in a way that allows for what Samir Amin, who was a brilliant economist who's written on the neo-colonial structures of West Africa, but also Africa in general, is what these global economic structures is allowing for the hidden transfer of values, which is some of it on raw materials from the global south to the global north, right? And British economist Jason Hickel, along with colleagues, have also actually tried to quantify how much raw materials was being transferred from Africa to Europe, but also to US. But they looked at it from the global south perspective. And of course, a big chunk of almost half of it, if not more of that, half of that percentage is coming from Africa. And they estimated that the natural that from 1990 to 2015, that's just over the course of 15 years, right after the structural adjustment programs that took place in the 80s, right, that the global north countries appropriated from countries in the global south 12 billion tons of raw material, right? And have also appropriated the equivalent of 822 million hectares of land for the expansion of agricultural, for mining, but also the expansion of agricultural, industrial agriculture. So there are numbers there that clearly show, right, how much of this transfer is still the defining terms of the post-colonial relations between Africa and European Union. So this idea that, you know, Africans government have had these their independence since the 60s, or the withdrawal of colonial troops, right, means that we have gained our sovereignty, which is so far from the truth, right? Because you have institutions like the European Union, the IMF, and the World Bank, who all of them, and the United Nations as well, and the US governments, and so on and so forth, who have found ways to still be able to export raw material or exploit and extract natural resources without overt violence, right? Without the colonial occupations that define colonialism, right? So it is still a form of colonialism, but truly through global economic terms. I can give you an example, for example, with aid conditionality, right? In order for them to give aid, then you have to remove red tapes and lower your standards of environmental management, and then also open up raw material for corporations, then we will give you aids. I mean, this is really how they're opening up a lot of these African raw material still for expropriation. So yes, the extraction of natural resources is still very much happening at a larger scale that most of us can even grasp.
Vielen Dank. Und ich bedanke mich auch schon mal bei
So many thanks, Abby, and thank you to the audience that have posted quite a few questions. And I think we could bring in those questions, and therefore we'll just leave with one last question for Abby and Shruti. I think we have directed a view towards those who are the perpetrators, and there is a growing awareness on the African continent. This awareness has always been there, I think, but it's still a growing movement. So how are those issues like inequalities, colonial continuities in the area of nature conservation and resource exploitation perceived from the communities? We know that the political sphere is something quite different, but how does the civil society, NGOs and so on, perceive this issue? Shruti, if you might want to start out.
So it's a bit of a, it's definitely a very tough question. I think in climate change, we talk about barriers to adaptation, and a key hard barrier for countries in Africa is finance. One anecdotal thing I can say is I was attending the Greater Horn of Africa conference where all the countries from the Horn of Africa region come together and they talk about climate change, the risks involved, and also what has been documented. And I was in one of the sessions for livestock management. And it's an absolute, it's very sad almost when you go to these sessions, because it's picture after picture of really just hot, dry environments, because as the world gets warmer, the air also can hold more moisture and it just sucks it out of the ground. And unfortunately, a lot of people rely on livestock. They're pastoralists and they're a bit nomadic in that sense. And I remember just seeing all these pictures and people documenting it all and being like, yes, we know what's going to happen next month. We know what's going to happen next month. We cannot vaccinate our livestock. They're way too vulnerable because of such stressful environment. But that means that we also have disease outbreak, and all of these factors compound, and it's known. It's a lot of the physical risks and burdens are known. The key problem is finance. They just can't do anything, and they sort of know why they can't do anything. I mean, obviously they're poor countries. They cannot finance this, and they know who should be financing it as well. But it's a difficult topic to raise also when you're trying to cope with these challenges, and it's sort of going down to a feeling of one crisis at a time, right? And again, the limit to actually adapting is the finance. They can't do anything. There's lots of on-the-ground NGOs that try and also instead try to make the market infrastructure a bit more strong, but it's quite difficult because a lot of people are migrating, a lot of people have to move. So yeah, I think the perception on the ground is very real. It's very brutal, and again, it shows the magnitude of the event and also of what's going on, but also the unfairness of what's going on.
Abi, gerne auch dazu.
Abi, would you like to add something?
Yeah, sure. Well, I was also from the nature conservation side. I think that there's a lot of in Africa, particularly of grassroots movement that are growing, but really detaching themselves from the old model of conservation, right? That the only way to achieve nature conservation is by removing people. Instead, the way they're centering it is to try and tie the struggle for nature conservation with other forms of struggle, which is mostly the struggle to completely free ourselves, African peasants, from agriculture, industrial agriculture, because we know that industrial agriculture right now is responsible for about, I think, 34% of climate change, carbon emissions. But also at the same time, it is one of the largest driver of biodiversity loss. So these movements on the ground understand that the only way to really achieve nature conservation is to link it to their struggle to hold on to their land and also fight agribusinesses that are being so aggressive right now in terms of land acquisition and expanding industrial agriculture for commodity production in Africa, right? And so those are the ones, they are fighting tooth and nail, going into every single space, including the Kenyan Peasant Leagues, and I think there are other, Shruti might know also that there were parallel events to the African Climate Summit, who was mostly focused on farmers, agricultural system and agroecology, but also having a strong component of strong elements of biodiversity conservation, right? And so instead of always, this is really where most of our fight is, rather than buying into the sense that protected area is the only way to be able to get us out of this mess or to slow down capitalism. We are actually trying, or these grassroots movement are actually going head to head and fighting capital and disrupting it, right? In order, because that is really the only way we can finally achieve nature conservation in a more just and equitable way, but also that tend to the needs and aspirations of rural Africans who are the one being dispossessed to protect those lands, right? Like they understand how central the issue of food sovereignty, agroecology, and so on and so forth is to biodiversity conservation.
Yeah, I'd like to add there that I do think the indigenous and local people, I know in Kenya, whenever I go to the villages, they really live off the land really sustainably. I mean, 2/3 of the world's arable land is in Africa. It's so rich. And more than half of the population depend on agriculture, but also more than half of the population are fed by small-scale farmers, not like large agribusinesses. It's small-scale farmers that cater to, but also are responsible for very little emissions, and yet they feed more than majority of the people on the continent. And this is all a lot of local knowledge that they've harvested, that they know how to use. I mean, there is problems right now because a lot of the farmers rely on rain-fed agriculture, and that's changing. But there is still a lot of local knowledge, and the fact of the matter is they've been living sustainably. They're subsisting sustainably till now. If you look at the fact that a lot of people are fed by small-scale farmers. So yeah, I think this ties in to a lot of consideration of how to conserve this beautiful culture that anyways exists there of living with the nature.
Vielen, vielen Dank an Sie.
Thank you very much to the two of you for once again directing the view towards the interior, so to speak. And this is basically the end of our panel round. We would now like to start answering questions. There are very many questions, so the shorter your answers, the more questions can be included in our discussion. And I would like to start right away. The curators in the back have clustered the questions and they helped me select the questions. So should your question not be raised here, don't be mad with me. And I would like to put two questions together. On the one hand, the question is, how should the European development aid be directed in areas where it has a negative impact on the interests of indigenous communities? And another question which goes into a similar direction is, how can we prevent that German and European development aid facilitates human rights violations, for example, with the Maasai? So how can we develop funding models that are better? So please jump in. Well, maybe I can start briefly. However, the question is already a very wide question, a very big question, and we cannot provide a solution here. But of course, we can try to describe the problem. If I understood the question directly, the basic problem of development aid is, and this might be one aspect of colonial continuity that we've not sufficiently talked about, is the constellation that we've had for 100 years now. It is a Western interest in nature conservation, and it's Western NGOs nowadays. However, from this colonial constellation, we know that certain things have been maintained, like, for example, with the Maasai. In the past, it was said there no Maasai, they're only Tanzanians, modern citizens, and to cooperate with indigenous communities is politically not really planned in the context of Tanzania. So the official development aid, as it is a bilateral instrument, so the question is, with whom can or should we cooperate? However, I can provide you a solution for that. Well, to rely on smaller civil society organizations and NGOs, for example, also NGOs from our countries who have groups there as well, and to investigate human rights violations in the course of projects that were funded with German development aid is something that we have already started. For example, when it comes to human rights violations in the Congo and also in Tanzania and Norongo and the relocation of Maasai. However, the German authorities are not doing anything. So it's not an easy situation for the Frankfurt Sociological Society because they've been active there for decades, and in part they're also responsible for this situation, and in their actions they are also dependent on the government. So I can only describe the dilemma in which we are trapped. And of course we can exert certain pressure on the NGOs, and we can also try to allocate donations that are outside of the state aid to different channels. And what I've already mentioned is that we've not had a critical discussion about development aid for quite a long time. So if we had another debate, then the government would be forced to openly talk about that. But currently the situation is actually silenced, or this situation is not really talked about from all the different sides. So thank you. How can we get out of this dilemma? One of the ideas, even though we know that we cannot provide a final solution here, would you like to add something, Shruti? I mean, the Maasai were brought up.
Yeah, so I think it's really terribly complex. I know, I mean, the Maasai are in Tanzania, they're in Kenya also. I'm not so sure how similar their situation is, given that Tanzania was under Germany and then Kenya was British. But I know that the Maasai, at least in Kenya, have taken a large hit because they actually had owned a lot of land but were forced to sell it for very low prices, and they didn't really know what they were doing. So in the end, a lot of them lost their land and had to move away. And right now, there's a lot of Maasai who also are forced to either engage in touristic sort of services or just not really engage within that part of society. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about that. I think there's a lot of NGOs that work with the Maasai with trying to conserve and also work with them and use their local knowledge to conserve. I know a really good project actually that's by the WIS Academy in Switzerland, where they're trying to protect the elephant corridors, and they also really hire a lot of local people around the Mount Kenya region for that. And the way that they try to do that is also to try and build some dams to also capture more rain during heavy raining periods, so it actually can go into the soil, and so that grass and plants can actually grow. Because the problem again with warmer temperatures is it sucks all that moisture out of the land, and the land becomes increasingly dry, and water can then just run off it, and this is such a vicious cycle. So there are projects out there that actually try and use the local people and their indigenous knowledge and work with them. And I think there is a lot of capacity there. I also know that the projects that have been the most successful in terms of communicating early warnings of climate and also allowing farmers to then redirect their efforts. So for instance, if they know it's going to rain a lot, they're not going to water their land a lot, because if they knew it would rain, they wouldn't have to waste all that water and they could save it for a dry day. And so there's a lot of effort like that. And the main way it goes through is through the local weather services, which then talks to the local chiefs and tribes and tribal leaders to try and communicate with them, as well as exchange their weather predictions, because each tribe has their own way of predicting the weather. And they come up with their own predictions, and then the local weather service has their predictions, and they meet up every once in a month and try and compare it. And this builds immense trust within the system, so that these people can actually trust what's happening, trust that climate change is happening, because they know it's happening. They can feel it, they really see it. And so I think this is another successful way in which engagement can happen. And again, always bottom up and always engaging the local people. A third way that I also, as a woman, find really good is when there's a lot of microfinance given to women groups. And this is the most successful way of harvesting local communities, so that they can also create their own sustainable economic environment that isn't affected by shocks from externalities. And so a lot of the women are able to get a small grant, and from that they're able to create their own businesses and also support one another in this really nice trust circle of helping each other out if one of them tends to fall through with their business choice. And so I think these three ways of harvesting indigenous knowledge, but working with them, exchanging knowledge, and also appreciating indigenous knowledge for what it is and gaining their trust and working in those streams, and engaging women especially are the ways that I've seen have been the most successful. And it gives me a lot of hope actually about engagement. But again, it should be that their trust is gained. That's the first step.
Vielen, vielen Dank. Und damit
Thank
wurde
you
auch
very much. And actually, this already answered another question, which was how can local communities and the NGOs on the ground be strengthened? And you already mentioned that. Another